Hey, welcome back to METROspectives. I'm Alex Roman, executive editor for Metro Magazine, and my guest today is Brian Dickson, founder of Bus Business Consultants. How's it going, Brian?
I am doing well. Alex, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for joining me. I think we're going to have a great conversation. You have a vast background. You've seen the transportation industry from multiple perspectives as an operator, as an executive consultant, through your work with Ground Transportation Insights, which I forgot to mention at the top. But tell us a little bit about your background and what kind of led you to create Buzz Business Consultants and GTI.
First of all, Alex, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I really appreciate it. We started this conversation a few weeks ago, leading up to our time together today, and
Mhm.
I've really been looking forward to this conversation. So, I definitely value you and Metro and the audience that you have. So, again, I'm very appreciative of the time that you're giving me today. From a background perspective, I've spent the better part of 30 years leading people in service-oriented businesses. And again, I've had the opportunity to lead people, to improve operations, and to help organizations perform better. And Bus Business Consultants and Ground Transportation Insights, which is my Substack publication, they really grew out of a desire to share those lessons more broadly across the ground transportation industry. I started my career at Disney in 1991. But interestingly enough, my first 14 years there, I didn't actually work in transportation. I started as a frontline employee, worked my way up into management. And that period, that first 14 years was incredibly formative because it taught me how to be a leader. It taught me about service excellence, a lot of the things that Disney's known about, quality, and as Disney would say, the guest experience.
Right.
I entered transportation in 2005. That was actually my first role with Coach America's Orlando location, which was called American Coach Lines here in Orlando. And over the last 2 decades, I've had the opportunity to lead organizations ranging from motor coach operations and transportation providers to equipment distributions businesses, and to be one of the key leaders in Disney's large scale transportation network. When I returned to Disney in 2016, I actually worked there a second time between 2016 and 2024. And across those roles, I had the opportunity to lead organizations of different sizes in different markets and facing many different challenges. And as I stepped back and looked at my career, one of the things I realized is that I had spent decades helping one organization at a time,
Mhm.
whether it was Disney, Coach America, Alliance Bus Group, or one of the other companies I worked for. All of my energy, my experiences, and the lessons that I learned were focused on one organization. And that led me, as I thought about Bus Business Consultants, I said, what if I could take that knowledge that I've gained through my education, through my leadership roles, through the successes I've had and the mistakes I've made in real world operations, and bring that to multiple organizations at the same time. And Ground Transportation Insights was a natural extension of that idea because not every company needs a consultant at the same time, but everyone can benefit from the ideas, the conversations, and the lessons that are learned across the industry. And GTI became a way for me to share those insights more broadly and create a platform for discussing leadership, culture, operational performance, and the future of ground transportation. And ultimately, both Bus Business Consultants and Ground Transportation Insights exist for the same reason, and that's to help organizations improve their performance, develop their leaders, and build the capabilities so they can intentionally create the futures that they want.
Great. Being an operator in a high volume area like Orlando, what are kind of the leadership lessons you've gathered over your career as an operator that still kind of shape the advice you give your clients today?
Well, there are numerous lessons that I could point to, but if I had to narrow it down, I'd say there are three that consistently show up in the advice that I give my clients today. The first is that organizations perform through their people. And you might say, well, that's obvious. And it is, but it oftentimes get overlooked. We spend a lot of time talking about equipment and technology, facilities, processes, and all of those things matter, but none of them create value on their own. An organization's people are what bring those resources and those assets to life. And that's why an organization's leadership is so important, because great leaders create the environment where their people can do their best work and where the organization can get the most out of the resources that it has available. The second lesson is that clarity creates performance. In my experience, many of the problems that leaders deal with, they're not capability problems, they're actually clarity problems.
Mm.
People don't understand what's expected of them. They don't know what success looks like. They don't know what the priorities are or how their work connects to the larger organization's goals. But when expectations are clear, accountability and decision making often improve and performance usually follows. And the third lesson is that discipline and humanity have to coexist. One observation I've made over the years is that discipline without humanity becomes bureaucracy, while humanity without discipline becomes chaos. And the strongest leaders I've worked with and the strongest organizations I've been a part of, they figured out how to balance both of those things. They care deeply about their people, but they've also established clear expectations and they hold themselves and their people accountable for results. And what's interesting is that those aren't really three separate ideas. They actually build on each other.
Mhm.
Organizations perform through their people. People need clarity to perform at their best. And leaders have to balance discipline and humanity if they want to create an environment where their people can succeed. And those ideas have shaped much of how I've led organizations over the years. And again, they continue to shape the advice I give my clients today.
Funny where we're talking offline about coaching Little League, and all those apply to coaching Little League as well.
Yes, they sure do. They sure do.
We were talking, we met at the American Bus Association. We're presenting the Innovative Model Coach Operator of the Year to Jared Stansel. And we were talking about kind of the industry and how things are going. Through your consulting work and your conversations you're having through GTI, what separates transportation organizations that are thriving today simply, versus simply surviving? Which, you know, was an issue prior to, the emergence out of COVID.
Sure, sure. Well, if I had to boil it down to one word, I would say intentionality. The organizations that thrive, they tend to be very intentional about what they're trying to achieve and how they're going to get there. They're not just reacting to whatever shows up that day. They have direction and they're disciplined about moving towards that direction and moving in that direction. Now, that doesn't mean they don't face challenges. They're dealing with rise of costs, workforce issues, maintenance problems, customer service concerns, and economic uncertainty, just like everybody else is. But the difference is that they don't allow those challenges to dictate their future. They're still investing in their leaders. They're developing their people. They're improving their processes. They're strengthening their organization while at the same time dealing with today's issues. By contrast, organizations that struggle, they often find themselves stuck in reaction mode. Every day becomes about solving the next problem, putting out the next fire, or responding to the next crisis. And
Mm.
eventually, there's so much energy expended on the issues of today that they just are exhausted. They don't have the time or the energy to invest in tomorrow. And one thing I've noticed is that healthy organizations tend to have options. They've invested in their people, they've developed their leaders, they've strengthened their business, and they've built capacity in a variety of ways. So as a result, they have flexibility and more choices available as the challenges come their way, versus the organization that's constantly operating in crisis mode. And
Mm.
those choices, they allow them to be intentional when they shape their future as opposed to being shaped by the future.
Mm. Great points. You have the pleasure of walking into organizations and, helping an operation that wants help, kind of find where they can be successful. When you enter those organizations for the first time, what are some of the early indicators that tell you where the real problems and opportunities are?
Well, the first thing I do is I try to understand how the leader sees the business. I'll ask questions, I'll listen carefully, and I'll try to understand what they believe is working, what they believe isn't working, and where they want to go and what challenges they're facing. And then I'll spend time observing their operation, meeting their people, and learning more about how the business actually functions. And what I'm doing is I'm actually looking for gaps. Is there a gap between where the organization wants to go and its ability to get there? Is there a gap between what the leadership believes is happening versus what the employees are actually experiencing? Is there a gap between their strategy and their execution? And often the biggest opportunities aren't found in the things that everyone already knows are broken. They're actually found in those gaps. One of the things I've learned over the years is that the first problem a leader identifies is rarely the actual problem. Oftentimes it's a symptom of a deeper issue. For example, a leader might tell me they have a driver shortage, but after I ask questions and dig into their processes, they actually are getting plenty of applicants. They just don't have anyone who owns the process and who's consistently following up and moving people through that process quickly enough. So they're losing those candidates to other operators. Or it could be they think they have a retention problem, but the real issue is actually somewhere in their training, their communication, their scheduling, or they have inconsistent leadership. And that's why I spend so much time listening and asking questions before I jump to conclusions. Because again, oftentimes the biggest breakthroughs happen when you don't focus on the symptoms, but you look for those deeper root causes.
And the trend that I think both Fred Ferguson at ABA and the leadership over at UMA, they talk about how the business has emerged a little stronger. People were able to go back and correct those processes and things that they were doing incorrectly, or they were just too busy. If someone's driving the bus, watching the bus, maintaining the bus, that's probably all the same person in a lot of cases. Are you getting the sense that, the industry has emerged a little bit stronger and a little bit more business savvy than it has been in the past?
I think it depends on the operator. I think
Okay.
some of them have, but I think some of them have figured out that they can operate leaner, and so they're doing that. And in some cases, that
Mhm.
being leaner is better, and that makes sense. But my understanding of kind of where we are as an industry is that we've lost capacity, but we've essentially returned to the pre-COVID demand. And so I
Mm.
think a lot of operators are actually, and obviously we've hit a bit of a speed bump from economically with what's going on over in the Middle East, and obviously driving fuel costs. But I still think a lot of operators are busy, and so in many cases, I think they've kind of returned to businesses as usual, but operating a little leaner. Like I said, I think a lot of operators, some of the more mature operators, have realized, hey, we've got to restore some of the resources that we had previously, while others are saying, hey, we figured out how to operate lean. We need to ride this as long as we can.
Yeah. And you mentioned a little bit, going back to kind of survival mode and the difference between operations that are functioning with processes and people who are kind of in that survival mode. One of the themes that kind of come up frequently in your writing is the idea of healthy organizations creating options. Can you talk a little bit about what that means and how leaders can begin moving from that survival mode to intentionally building for the future?
So when I talk about healthy organizations having options, what I'm really describing is they have flexibility. I've seen companies that are one customer, one key employee, one major breakdown, or one unexpected expense away from a crisis. And when that happens, the leaders don't have a lot of choices. Their decisions are largely going to be dictated by their circumstances. By contrast, a healthy business, well, they have room to maneuver. If a key employee leaves, they can adapt. They've got other people who can step in and fill that gap. If a major customer is lost, they can absorb that impact. If the market changes or if the market conditions change, they can adjust with those. Um, they have options because they have built their business and they built resiliency into their business. That now, again, as I said earlier, they're going to deal with the same challenges that the other companies are, but again, they have resilience built into their business. They don't know where those challenges are going to come from, but because they've invested in their people, because they've strengthened their operation, they developed their people, and they built more resiliency into the operation, they're going to have the flexibility when those challenges arise. And this year is a perfect example that, I don't think anyone thought that we were going to have the challenges we've had from a fuel cost perspective and some of the other issues we've had this year. But the best organizations have been able to ride that wave as opposed to being consumed by it.
Yeah. And if you're talking to a transportation owner or executive kind of today, looking at the future, what are the first three things you kind of would focus on over the next kind of 12 months to strengthen their organization?
Well, the first thing I do is get clear about where the organization is today versus where they're trying to go. If I ask an owner, if I say, where do you want to be in 12 months, and they don't have a clear answer, that's usually where I'm going to start.
Mm.
Because before you can improve a process or improve your business, you have to understand where you are currently, and you have to have a clear picture of where you want to go. And the second thing I would do is identify the handful of priorities that are going to matter most. That are going to be the biggest leverage points that are going to enable you to move the business from where it is now to where it's going to be. Most organizations don't have a shortage of opportunities. They have way too many. And so the challenge is deciding which of those priorities matter the most and then being disciplined enough to focus on them. Because if everything is a priority, nothing is a priority. And
Right.
then the third thing is execution. Once you've identified where you are, where you want to go, and what matters most, that's when the real work begins. That's when you have to align your people, your resources, and your attention around those priorities, and you have to consistently execute against them. The difference a year from now isn't going to be that you developed a plan and put it on the shelf. It's going to be that you developed that plan and you executed against it consistently. And most organizations already have, again, more ideas than they could pursue. So the challenge is staying focused and doing the work that's required to turn those good ideas into results.
Yeah. And, building on that, I think, for these organizations who don't know what the ground step is or how to figure out where they want to go, what are some resources and some things they can do to determine what those goals that they can set and move forward with? Where can they kind of find those ideas?
Well, I think a lot of that can come from engaging through associations. There's a lot of great content that comes from associations. I offer new clients, the first hour is free. So if a client wants to just schedule some time with me and talk about the issues they have for that first hour, I'm happy to give them as much advice as we can pack into an hour, so to
Right.
speak. And a lot of times we'll do that. I have a couple of operators that I just meet with on a regular basis, and we just talk for 30 minutes a week, just on some of the challenges they have. Actually, Lewis Bookoff with Bussy and I are going to be launching a new, it's called the Operator Exchange. We're going to launch that in early July. Sorry to shamelessly promote that. But it's 1 hour a month. If you think about when you were in college, the professor would have office hours. It's kind of
Mhm.
like that. So we're going to have an hour a month where we're going to host a roundtable, invite operators where they can just come and bring their biggest challenges, and we'll talk about them. We'll obviously have other operators on there. So between myself, between Lewis, and some of the other operators on the call, hopefully they can get some solutions to take back to their business.
Sounds great. Be sure I'll get that information for you from you, and I can link it in the show notes once we get this episode up. Brian, again, thanks again for your time. I think my final question, kind of looking ahead, what gives you the most optimism about the transportation industry, and where do you see the biggest opportunity for organizations right now?
Well, what gives me optimism is that the people in this industry are so willing to learn.
Mm.
Throughout, as I said, I've worked in the industry for many years. I've also participated in industry associations, in conferences, and more recently through my consulting work and publishing Ground Transportation Insights, that I've had an opportunity to interact with a lot of operators. And one of the things I've consistently seen is that people are always looking for better ways to do things. I found that most operators are pretty practical, and if you can demonstrate value, they're willing to listen. And they don't necessarily care if the idea comes from technology, a leadership book, another operator, or a consultant. They just care about whether it's going to help them serve their customers better, improve their performance, solve some of the challenges they're having, or make their business stronger. And to me, that's where the opportunity is, because the organizations that I think are going to be the most successful as we move forward aren't necessarily going to be the ones with the biggest fleets or the newest buses, they're going to be the ones that have identified the best ideas, that have adapted them to their business, and then have done the hard work of implementing them. And we talked a lot about strong leadership today, and that's going to be key because at the end of the day, strong leadership is what's going to take those good ideas and actually turn them into results.
Great. And not a shameless plug on my end. I am plugging shamelessly. Brian also has a few articles up on metro-magazine.com if you'd like to read those. Brian, thanks again for your time. Anything you'd like to add before we go?
Again, just thank you for the opportunity to speak to your audience today. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to continue to work with you, Alex.
Great. Thanks again for your time. I appreciate the insights.
Thank you.